Some people will argue that you can have democracy without liberalism. I'm not one of them. I believe they go hand in hand.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Welcome to our second Afternoon Light Live for 2026. Now, it's often said that to be born an Australian is to win the lottery of life. But yet, over the last 2 decades, our civic culture, our democratic culture has felt increasingly brittle. We've had national debates collapsing into echo chambers and ad hominem attacks, and there's been a broader decline in civic participation, in a sense of respecting our neighbours and trusting in our institutions. And there is, I think you'd agree, a sense that our social cohesion is declining. Well, in an echo of our modern day concerns, over 80 years ago, Robert Menzies said in the middle of World War II that our democracy is a living spirit that needs nurturing. It wasn't good enough to assume that Australia's democracy will just simply look after itself. It requires nurturing not only by our political leaders, but by the guardians of our institutions across the media, culture, and education. Now, the urgency of this question of our quality of democracy was sharpened by events over the last few months. Of course, the massacre at Bondi, and then the violent clashes we've witnessed recently with the visit of Israel's president in Sydney and Melbourne. So today we're asking what would seem a deceptively simple question: what are the conditions for a successful democracy? Not merely a set of mechanisms, elections, parliaments, courts, rule of law, but there are deeper cultural conditions that give those mechanisms legitimacy and force. Now, I'm delighted for our discussion today to be joined by 2 excellent guests. To my left, I have Lydia Khalil, who's a program director at the Lowy Institute, and she's been working on an exciting project on understanding democratic erosion. Welcome, Lydia.
Thank you.
And our own historian here at the Robert Menzies Institute, Dr. Zachary Gorman, who will draw on a recently written paper on the conditions for a successful democracy. And this paper draws on a policy dialogue that both Lydia and Zachary participated in June last year. So welcome, Zach.
It's good to be back.
Now, as always with our Afternoon Light Lives, I'll have 30 minutes of discussion with our guests before opening up to your questions from the live audience. So, Lydia, I'm going to start with you. A quick, simple question, I think. How would you judge the current health of Australia's democracy in 2026?
Well, key question, obviously, Georgina, and thank you for having me to talk about this stuff. Look, I think by many measures, the Australian democracy is in quite good shape. If you take a look at, any major global indice that measures democracy and its democratic health, whether it's things like VDEM or the McKinnon Index or Economic Intelligence Unit, Australia ranks quite highly. As an aggregate, we've got a high degree of electoral integrity, high degree of integrity in our electoral institutions. Probably aside from the Scandinavian countries, we offer a very good quality of life and services. But there are warning signs, and it's kind of my job, I think, to pay attention to those warning signs, so they're always in front of mind to me. One of the major ones, I would say, is growing inequality. That is key. So we've seen not only income inequality grow in Australia, but crucially wealth inequality. And there's an inequality divide across the generations and across issues like housing, which are incredibly important, because the promise of democracy is that the next generation will do better than the previous one. And we're at a situation now where that may not be the case for many, many people. So that is a big, big warning sign. You can't have a successful democracy with high degrees of inequality, not just in income, but in other aspects of life. I think there's also this persistent trust deficit within Australian democracy as well. I mean, Menzies talks about that in his speeches, in his writings. There's this persistent distrust or mistrust of high office holders and politicians. Politicians are seen as self-interested, they're working for special interests. There's a perception of corruption, even relatively few instances of corruption, comparatively speaking. And so a level of distrust, I think, can be healthy with democracy. I think it's actually the rationale for democracy because we don't trust one person to hold all the power, but too much it can go awry. So that's one condition. The other one I would say is what you alluded to in your introduction is a polarization and a fracturing around very key important issues. So when people are coming at a particular important issue, whether it's stuff around overseas conflicts or social issues, there's a very black and white thinking, and then there's a morality assigned to it. So not only am I absolutely right and you're absolutely wrong, but you are evil and I am good for holding that position. So I think that's quite troubling for democracy. And relatedly is this kind of decline of small L liberalism, which I know the Institute is quite exercised of, right? I think in our body politic and other things which we can get into around, the impacts of disinformation, which are quite corrosive to Australia. So Australia is dealing with all of these challenges. I don't think there is an acute condition that's affecting its health, but some underlying things that if they're not addressed could lead to long-term damage, just like having high blood pressure could lead to a heart attack later on.
Yeah, we need some prevention better than trying to fix the problem once it is completely ingrained. Tell me, you grew up in the States. Do you get a sense that we're in better shape than the States?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, my perspective on living in Australia, being a migrant, now a citizen of Australia, is shaped not only by growing up in the US and kind of experiencing, as we all have been, around the decline of democracy in the United States, particularly in the Trump era, but I would argue preceding that. But also, too, my family is a migrant family twice over. We migrated to the United States from Egypt, which was an authoritarian country ruled by the military, many constrictions on freedoms and liberties. And so I've seen it from both sides. And it's particularly troubling to me with someone from that perspective, coming from a country that is a dictatorship, to see some of the dynamics embed itself into the US. It's things that I'm like, this reminds me of what it was like in Egypt, or what I know of Egypt under these things, in terms of the rising of disinformation, belief in conspiratorial thinking, folks looking to a strongman leader to solve their problems, society's problems. So I think both of those perspectives and experiences really do shape how I assess and experience Australian democracy, and actually I'm quite grateful for it.
Before I go to Zach, I guess I'd be interested in your response to recent events. So since we had the policy dialogue in June last year, we've obviously had the horrific Bondi massacre and then this very visceral protest response to the visit of Israeli President Isaac Herzog. I mean, do you think things are getting worse in Australia, or is it a tipping point for us, or is this just a continuation of a set of circumstances you've observed over many years?
Well, I think obviously we were all very confronted with the Bondi attack. It was the largest terrorist attack on Australian soil. I mean, a lot of my work is taking a look at extremist and terrorist movements and how they intersect with democracy. And so I was shocked, saddened like many other people, but not quite surprised because again, it's my job to kind of look at these warning signs and see them coming. But in preparation for coming to speak to you and Zach, I was reading some of, Menzies' work and taking a look at the Forgotten People broadcast and stuff where he talks about democracy. And one of the things I was really struck by is that the lamentations are the same. We're perpetually fretting about the state of democracy. Are we doing it good enough? Are we taking it for granted? Lack of respect to elected leaders and politicians. It's the same issues and the same questions. So I had kind of a wry smile on my face when I was reading these, what Menzies was saying, because it seems like that is a perpetual condition of democracy, is to worry about it.
Yeah. It's like a good marriage, though. You've got to constantly work at it. You've got to constantly work at your democracy.
Yeah, democracy is never consolidated. It's not an end state. It's a practice. Yeah.
And that, I guess, is the era of the 90s, where there was sort of the hubristic declaration that democracy is the end point of an evolution of political life. Well, no. I mean, we've got to keep working at it. Zach, you're a historian. Australia is said to be, I think, the oldest democracy, modern democracy, but it obviously has its flaws. Can you give our audience a sense of the historic roots of Australian democratic culture? What makes Australia's democracy quintessentially Australian?
Well, I think it is interesting that it has always been about that sort of search for distinctiveness in some ways. So Australia, modern Australia, of course, started as a British transplant. So we got a lot of our institutions and political culture from Great Britain. So it became what's distinctive, what actually differentiates our political culture from Great Britain. And the thing that was there from the outset is that we never really had a landed aristocracy. We always had high wages, high egalitarianism. The Chartists, who were basically really subdued in Britain itself, were able to have free reign here in Australia. So we had universal manhood suffrage from the 1850s, far earlier than Great Britain. We had female suffrage from the 1890s, one of the earliest countries in the world. The debate between us and New Zealand goes on, but they weren't technically a dominion when we had female suffrage. So
should we give them Pavlova and we'll take female suffrage?
Potentially. It is one of those debates.
Yeah.
And it should be even more quintessential to you as a South Australian because, of course, South Australia gets to claim the prize.
Yeah.
But even the way our constitution was set up was incredibly democratic. We had a system of constitutional conventions where all of the delegates were directly elected by each of the Australian colonies. And then the constitution that they drafted had to be approved by referendum at each of the Australian colonies. So we were far more sort of deliberately democratic in how we were set up than, say, somewhere like the United States, which in the late 18th century still had a lot of the ancient fears of democracy as being unstable and unwieldy, and that you needed a mixed constitutions of checks and balances because the people ultimately couldn't be trusted.
Robert Menzies talked about this spirit that democracy was more of a culture, and we needed a democratic culture, a civic culture, rather than just institutions and mechanisms to facilitate it. Can you explain that, what he meant by that? And I think also, why was he worried in the middle of World War II? I mean, that might be an obvious answer to that question, but explain the circumstances.
Well, it's World War II, but it's important to understand that World War II takes place on the back of the Great Depression. People think that the two world wars are similar circumstances, but they're very different. In World War I, there was a lot of jingoism. There was a lot of the war's going to be over in a couple of weeks. It'd be this easy victory. World War II, the reason there was so much appeasement is because everyone was sort of lethargic and depressed. We had just went through an entire world war. Then we'd had the Great Depression, and now it seemed this inevitable war happening again that we just couldn't stop. And one of the reasons why you had the rise of things like fascism and communism was because it looked like the democratic countries couldn't provide for their citizens. They couldn't provide peace, and they couldn't provide financially for their people. Menzies had an optimistic view because he was always a bit of a Whig. He had the Whig view of history, of the great battles that had gone into winning parliamentary democracy, how it had succeeded over the centuries. And he was confident that it could succeed again if there would be something of a civic revival. But he knew that what it ultimately needed, because the institutions were centuries old and they had evolved through the wisdom of time rather than some great architect who had all these brilliant ideas and set them up all at once, was that it would have to be a cultural revival. He used the metaphor of a musical instrument. You could have the most expensive, beautiful musical instrument in the world, but if you played it without knowing how to play it, and particularly without any sort of talent and inspiration, then you'd be nothing but an annoyance to all of your neighbours. You really have to have that spirit, that inspiration to make democracy work.
You've been undertaking, Lydia, a project called Understanding Democratic Erosion, and it's on the Lowy Institute website now. You've identified factors that erode faith in democratic institutions, and you've used a systems analysis to look at this. Can you give us an explanation of what are the things that erode democracy?
Sure. Well, if I could be presumptuous and say, I think people who are trying to understand declines in democracy, I think make two very common errors. So one of them is trying to pinpoint one factor or a set of factors that lead to democratic decline. And I think the other one is that we conceive of democratic decline as linear or cause and effect. So whether the curve is steep or not so steep, it's conceived of it this way, and you can reverse it by going up the path. But in any case, it's linear. So we argue that both of those things are not the best way to try to understand democracy or democratic decline. One, we say that we need to look at it more as democratic erosion rather than democratic decline or democratic backsliding. And so if you conjure up the image of, say, natural erosion, say waves coming up against a rock, or any type of natural erosion, it's kind of the gradual wearing away, right? That's what most often happens with democracies. There are very little modern examples of a coup or executive takeover that happens all of a sudden. You might have had that in other parts of history, but at the moment, this is not really the trend that we're looking at. It is this kind of undermining of the quality of democracy through erosion. So it's not really just one set of factors. The other thing that we ask people to consider is that democracy is a system. And so if you want to understand its erosion, you have to look at it through systems thinking. And so systems thinking involves taking a look at the conditions that contribute to democratic erosion, that provide opportunities for actors to engage in activities, taking a look at those actors and what they do, because actors are quite important, because democracy is government, by the people, of the people, for the people. And also, what are the processes and the dynamics that they engage in that lead to this erosion? So in applying the systems thinking approach, we identify what was, the wonk term is reinforcing loops of democratic erosion. So it's things like, the big one is when an anti-democratic actor or a set of actors gain power, right? And then they undermine checks and balances of institutions. That's another one. The decline in trust in democracy, or the faith in democracy that it will actually deliver outcomes, to things like engagement in political violence, which is a complete breakdown, really, of the covenant of democracy, which is that we solve our issues not through force or through violence, but through various other mechanisms. And so we identified those reinforcing loops that contribute to democratic erosion through that project. But inherently, it's taking a look at it as a living, breathing system, understanding how that system works, and then understanding the loops of erosion that impact it.
So in recent years, obviously, we had the pandemic, a lot of restrictions on our freedoms. Parliament here in Victoria was put on ice for a very long period of time. I think particularly the response here in Victoria, people felt that democracy really was ceasing to function in the way it had before. Do you think those instances have contributed to an erosion of democracy in the Australian context, or a sense that it's under threat at least?
Well, I think we have to be careful in terms of taking a look at those dynamics under an emergency setting. So at that time, we had emergency measures in place. It was a declaration of a state of emergency, and that's legal and lawful in order to deal with immediate crisis. The issue with Australia is that power was invoked very frequently and for a prolonged period of time. And so it tested the patience and the trust of many people in that process. And so I think we're seeing a lot of the after effects of that, and a large hangover, I think, from the COVID days. Again, to these dynamics around trust in institutions, the intentions of our political leaders, and also in the rise of disinformation. We saw a huge explosion in mis and disinformation during those COVID pandemic years that we experienced. And also an increase in this growing anti-government, anti-establishment, anti-institutional sentiment, which is coming out in various ways. It could be on the extreme end of the groups and movements that I study that espouse violence and conspiracy against government, toward a kind of a disillusionment with the two-party system, where people are looking for independence and third parties to shake things up. And so you've got a whole spectrum of responses to that hangover of what happened.
Did you see a sharp downward trend in trust in institutions through that COVID period? Was there a sort of a correlation, do you think, of restriction of liberty and people starting to think, I don't trust these guys in charge, there's something wrong here?
Well, I think the polling was interesting, at least what I saw in some of the studies. There still seemed to be quite a high degree, and I think it's still the case in Australia, of trust in institutions of, say, public health and various other public institutions within Australia. I think where the decline in trust started to happen was more around the political and electoral class, right? But then certainly you had a growing segment within the population that distrusted both, that just felt like the system was not functioning at all to their advantage. And studies around mistrust and distrust in Australia do show a fragmentation. So you have a portion of the society which is generally better educated, high socioeconomic cohort that has greater level of trust and legitimacy put into our system, versus another that is not that has lower levels of trust. And so there's this kind of gap in between particular segments.
It's interesting, in a previous policy dialogue we held the year before last, it was on the health of the two-party system, the future of the two-party system. And it seems that every year subsequent, it seems to get worse and worse and worse for the two major parties. But the trend against the two major parties, from what we could observe, was really, it started in 2016, not in COVID, for example. And it's declined and declined and declined. And now you're seeing even the populist right-wing party One Nation, which had been a protest party since the 90s, is now gaining greater support, according to the polls, than the 80, what are we at now, almost 82-year-old Liberal Party. So quite an extraordinary change in political circumstances and political dynamics. I mean, Zach, do you have a historical explanation for what's going on?
Well, I would say that the decline of the two-party system in particular is very much a symptom of, or a reflection of, that dissatisfaction with democracy more broadly, because Menzies made a strong argument for the two-party system in the sense that it is the only way in which you have a direct say in who you're going to govern. You get to choose either that person or this person is going to be in power. They have to have a comprehensive policy program that affects all areas of government. Once you're voting in minor parties, that whole paradigm shifts. And when you're not going to get an overall majority in Parliament, it's going to be sort of negotiations, and you're going to have a lot less control over actually what legislation goes through. You saw that, say, with the Gillard government. Gillard had promised not to have a carbon tax. She gets into a minority government situation. It becomes one of the negotiating tools, and that created a lot of the real vitriol against Gillard. So these things have happened before. I am a bit skeptical about, say, treating misinformation and disinformation as an entirely new phenomenon. I think it is an endemic part of the democratic tradition. I think it's the 1800 US presidential election where one of the tactics was to convince the other party that their candidate had actually secretly died and nobody knew about it, which seems very similar to the sort of hoaxes that you would have in modern politics. And it's an interesting back and forth because obviously with the rise of the internet, it's easier to spread mis and disinformation than it ever has been. But at the same time, it's also easier to cross-reference your sources and see what other people are saying. When you were in some rural farm in the 19th century, it was a lot more difficult to find another source of information.
Lydia, it's often said that the system of voting we have here in Australia, so it's compulsory and preferential, that it drives the centre, right? We end up with very centrist politics, so centre-right, centre-left, but none of the extremes. Now, we haven't had an election, of course, since these really bad polling figures for the coalition parties, at least. Not so bad for Labor, although still pretty bad for Labor, let's be honest. So who knows where it'll end up on election day in 2028. But, I mean, tell me, do you think that the system here does drive a sort of more centrist polity, or are we seeing that the erosion of the two-party system is going to drive results that are quite divided, a nation very much divided?
Yeah, look, I think it still does. I think it still does drive to the center. I think if you contrast that to the United States, for example, because there's no compulsory voting, there's a huge impetus in terms of candidates to get people out to vote. And so how do you do that? It's you appeal to your base. And who's your base? It's the people who are most exercised of an issue, the ones who will oftentimes take very strident positions on particular things. And so it does tend to drive politics outside of the center in that sense. So I think that serves as a protective factor in Australia. Some people will say it also drives complacency, which I think that's also true. Sometimes I question, I don't really have an answer to this, is how bad is complacency actually? It might be kind of controversial to say this. It's because we do want an active citizenry as an ideal, but is a sort of self-satisfied, mostly complacent citizenry a good second best? Maybe. Maybe we could think about it that way. And again, a preferential system does make it more difficult for these minor parties to gain a hold into power. But the other point with the minor parties as well, too, is that people can take a look at them as a corrective, as an important signaling to what it is that they want to communicate to our elected leaders and politicians. And so I think that that's important. But at the same time, it makes the long-term solutions and the long-term thinking that Menzies that talks about as being crucial and mitigating against this short-termism much more difficult.
I mean, we've seen pretty violent protests over the last few years, obviously post-October 7th, but there'd been pushback during the COVID lockdowns as well. Is the fact that we see a high level of protest activity a sign that the system isn't working, or is that maybe a more engaged citizenry who is getting out there physically rather than just online or in their heads or in their quiet kitchen table conversations? They're getting out there to make their opinions heard.
I think generally I'm of the view that protest and mass mobilization is not a bad thing for democracy. It obviously depends on how it's carried out and whether or not there's violence in that, what the particular issues are that people are exercised of and want to promote. All of that stuff is important. But I do think the right to protest, the right to assembly, all of those things are critical for healthy democracies, and they should be protected.
I guess, my observation, and we'll get the historian's view here, is that we're not a very strongly protesting society just as a cultural phenomenon. There obviously have been protest movements throughout our history, but this sort of sense that, Hyde Park in Sydney or Spring Street, the State Library in the CBD in Melbourne, that they're overrun every weekend with protesters, that's unsettling and it's unfamiliar, and it gives a sense that we are a society incredibly divided, and we've got people with hard-felt grievances who don't think the system is working, and that gives an overall sense that democracy is pretty sick. But I mean, Zach, is this something that is just a part of the Australian history, Australian democratic story, and we should just take a Bex and have a good lie down?
Well, it's interesting. Alex McDermott, who's one of the fellows here at the Robert Menzies Institute, he had an article in the AFR last week where he was comparing the recent protests to the Vietnam moratorium movement and the first protest in 1970, and how that had sort of shifted to these public protests that particularly sort of blocking streets and stuff like this that we didn't necessarily have a historical tradition of, although there had been some, say, sectarian street parades between the Orangemen and the Irishmen that had similar themes. But one of the things I was discussing with Alex about that article was the thing in 1970 was that what was being debated was Australia's involvement in the Vietnam War and whether Australia's troops should be withdrawn. I think one of the drawbacks to globalization and how engaged we are on the internet right now is that we are constantly fighting, Australia's democracy is constantly fighting all the world's battles. We have unsolvable problems because they're not our problems, and we lose sight of our real neighbour because we're trying to see 7 billion people at the same time. So I think global citizenship has almost become the erosion of citizenship in some ways.
Very interesting point. Lydia, did you have a response to this? It's globalization's battles on our doorstep aren't very helpful.
Well, I was struck by a couple of things that both you and Zach were saying and what that prompted me to think about. The way that you were framing some of the protests gets to the heart of this issue in democracy around competing rights, right? And how do we balance people's competing rights? How do we balance security versus expression? How do we balance minority rights versus what is good for the greater whole? So that gets to a really important key aspect of democracy that is part of the struggle of democracy. And I think Zach's point is interesting. And it goes to also your point, Zach, about the issues around disinformation. Absolutely right. Lies, rumors, innuendo have been part of the human condition forever, right? I think now what we're seeing is both the scale and the speed and the economic incentives around particular platforms that have contributed to this issue around information and disinformation as being particularly acute. And I just point to say...
So as in dodgy information makes good clickbait, which makes the tech tech companies more money and
yes, we're all
yeah.
operating on the attention economy. We are now the product in terms of our data and our information and what it is that we're doing. And while it's absolutely true that we have access to a lot more information and can fact check and see different perspectives, what's happening is a pollution and an overwhelm of the information ecosystem that I think it's actually making it much harder for us to deal with these issues, to become exercised of global conflicts as we see them, to have that immediacy and reaction, and to realize that we're living in an information ecosystem that privileges these heightened emotional reactions to the various issues of the world.
Yeah. Look, thank you, Lydia and Zach. We have now a lot of audience questions to get through. I've got a question here from Wing Tang. I suspect this will be for Zach because it relates to our paper here on the conditions for a successful democracy. And Wing asks, where are the forgotten people in these conditions for a successful democracy? Menzies said that they are, for the most part, unorganised and unself-conscious. So I guess perhaps this is the complacent part of the population.
Well, Australia has this phenomenon that's basically, you could describe it as the lucky country, which was obviously a criticism when Donald Horne first used it against the Menzies government. But there is this sense in which throughout our history we have fallen over backwards into our prosperity, that we haven't actually had to struggle. Even the birth of Australian democracy, the fact that we didn't have to have an Australian revolution like there was an American revolution, we just got it sort of handed to us on a silver platter. So Australians only really start to get engaged when things are going wrong. And it's a lot of finger pointing at who we can scapegoat. But Menzies made a really important point about having a sense of personal responsibility about Australian democracy, that if we're the ones who are responsible for electing our leaders, then the flaws of Australian democracy are ultimately a reflection on us. We're the ones voting short-termism. We're the ones voting for our own self-interest at the ballot box over what might be in the long-term interest of the country as a whole. And that is why Menzies' focus was very much on cultural change, because democracy relies on these things that you can't compel. You can't compel people to buy into the system. You have to inspire people to buy into the system.
Yeah, and of course, education was part of it too. Menzies was very committed to fostering an educated nation because he wanted people to be able to think critically, not just take whatever the government told them as truth. But perhaps, it comes back to bite. And they always say we always get the leaders we deserve. So maybe there's something in that. Did you have a response to that question, Lydia, about the sort of forgotten people in all of this? Where do they sit?
I think Zach covered it pretty well, but I think it does kind of go to that heart of, the issue that I brought up early on, which is around this inequality, this sense of growing inequality, and how do we address that in Australia?
Yeah. I think that is a genuine problem, that people don't have a sense that the best days are ahead of us. They're behind us. This is a question for you, Lydia, from Talal Raza, who's a PhD student at Melbourne Uni. Talal's an international student. He understands I hope you don't mind me quoting you, Talal. You understand very little about Australian politics. Well, hopefully we'll fix that today. How do you, Lydia, reflect on the findings of the report against the backdrop of the Bondi terror attack in Sydney, the increase in communal tensions and soaring popularity of the One Nation Party in some of the recent polls? Is Australia gradually heading towards populist isolationism? And how should an international audience understand the implications of these developments for the future of Australia's democracy and international positioning?
Is that all? Well, I think my understanding of Australian politics is probably marginally better, so keep your hopes in check. Maybe we can talk about the issues around populism and whether Australia might be going that way. Look,
can you define populism? Because I guess there's a danger, I always think, that you say something's populist when you don't agree with it. You think, that's populist because it's not the sensible, right way of thinking, which is my way of thinking. So I think we need to be probably upfront in defining what it actually is.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll try to give my kind of understanding and framing of it, which is a movement that positions the people against the elite. So that it's a movement that tends to speak for the people, and there's an inherent kind of assumption or underlying it that the elite is responsible either for problems or that they're not truly representative of quote unquote the people. You talk, Georgina, and all the polls and the news now are talking about, the rise of One Nation as a populist party. I think that is concerning for the health of Australian democracy, at least as I understand and observe it. Some people might differ from that assessment. Some people will say that, or have argued that actually populism can spur democratic innovation, or it can serve as an important wake-up call to the establishment. But maybe I'll try to lay out why I think populism is particularly corrosive, because I think overall it's not good for democracy, despite it pretending to speak on the part of the people. One is this anti-elitism and anti-institutionalism that's inherent to populism can get out of control very quickly. For moving toward a corrective, it just can serve as this runaway train to being incredibly destructive, right? What it also tends to do is that there has to be a vector for this populist movement. There has to be an avatar. Usually that is some sort of populist leader that is not seeking to be more democratic, but it's one that's seeking to be control, and they often have anti-democratic tendencies, particularly far-right populist leaders. But populist leaders across the spectrum fall into this, right? And so that reduces checks and balances. When you tear down institutions, you're also tearing down the checks and balances and the authority and the legitimacy of these institutions that we rely on in democracy. It's also illiberal, because it's a majoritarian sentiment. And some people will argue that you can have democracy without liberalism. I'm not one of them. I believe they go hand in hand. And I also think it's dangerous because it's often sustained by this politics of grievance. And so what people are looking for, again, is this avatar for the expression of their grievance rather than actual real solutions. So for all of these things, and it's also polarizing, populist movements and populist leaders, they tend to want to identify a scapegoat, whether that's a particular ethnicity, whether it's migrants, whether it's the elite, whether it's the corporate sector. And then they hone in on that, and it becomes quite polarizing. And oftentimes it can also lead to violence, which, as we said, is anathema to the democratic process.
And of course, populism exists on both the left and the right. We're focusing on One Nation at the moment, and I guess in the UK context, it's reform, but there've been historically...
Latin America full of leftist populist movements over the decades.
Yeah. And I think that definition you started with is really, really helpful. A question here from Michelle Smith. Political parties are not mentioned in the Australian Constitution. Do you imagine a future where politicians represent their communities rather than political parties? I think, Zach, you were slightly addressing this question already. We didn't, way back when, there weren't political parties, really, were there?
Yeah, well, Menzies in 43, where we did have what was then a record number of independents, and there was movements very much like the Teals, with the fraying of the United Australia Party, referred to it as a lucky bag system, lucky dip system of democracy, where you really have no control because you're just electing the individual, and then there's going to be all sorts of negotiations. We did have a system like that in early Australian democracy. From the 1850s, it became so clear that the Australian public wouldn't elect a conservative leader because conservatism was landed aristocracy back then, that everyone started calling themselves liberals, and you had like a real negotiation in Parliament because there weren't any hard and fast parties. I don't think that that's necessarily the solution, but one of the things we do have as a recommendation in the policy paper is that Menzies was a big proponent of actually increasing the size of the Australian Parliament and having electorates that would therefore be smaller and represent more tangible communities of interest. That helps with that connection that people feel between their elected member and their community, but it also allows for more diversity of views within the major parties themselves. And that is one of the things that Australia is notable for. We have one of the smallest Westminster democracies around, and therefore we have one of the most disciplined party systems around. You're not really allowed to raise an independent viewpoint. Whereas you look at, say, the US party system with the size of Congress, there are a very diverse range of what it means to be a Republican or what it means to be a Democrat.
Yeah, I think we've seen, and you're the historian, Zach, you can correct me if I'm wrong, less and less acceptance on the part of the Liberal Party for crossing the floor, whereas there had been traditionally a bit more latitude for MPs to cross the floor, particularly on sort of social conscience issues. Now it really is, well, if you're not with us, you're against us. Whereas, I mean, the Labor Party had the caucus pledge and it was very much, you know, you have to stay with the party's policies, otherwise you're out. And so I wonder if there's a sense that if you are voting for a member of the coalition in an electorate, you're not going to get a community representative, you're just going to get a major party representative, and there's a pushback against that.
Oh, definitely. And you look at, say, Tim Wilson as the one example of where they did let a Liberal Party candidate have a bit of free range because they had a proven track record of already being an MP and the dividends that they were able to get from that. Whereas if you're a new candidate standing in a seat, let alone a seat that's like a traditional Labor seat, the main thing they want you to do is not cause any issues. They don't want you to sort of speak their mind because the Liberal brand is something that they need to protect.
Thanks, Zach. I've got a question here from Jorge Ninnik, I think is how it's pronounced. I suspect this is for Lydia. Thank you for all your inputs, Jorge says. Could you please expand on how growing social inequalities, the rich becoming richer, the increase of distance between the top, middle and bottom, is threatening democracies?
Well, it's, I think, problematic on a global scale, and I think it's problematic on a national scale in various democracies. So there was a big study out of the University of Chicago recently where they took a look at a cross-sectional study of many different democratic nationalities. And one of the things that they found that was common to all of them in trajectories of democratic erosion was inequality, growing inequality. And they looked at particularly wealth and income inequality. So that's a big one. And so the reasons of that are many. You know, we talked about them in our earlier conversations where people don't feel like the promise of democracy is being fulfilled, which will offer them a good quality of life. And instead, they'll start to turn to people who offer easy solutions. Or they say, democracy is too complicated, too inefficient. Why don't we just have the system where we have, you know, a business guy come and make all the decisions for us, or some strongman leader? It's much more efficient, and we don't need to worry about the inefficiencies of democracy and that whole cut and thrust of it. But it's also on a global level. We're seeing it as part and parcel of the excesses of globalization. We're seeing it particularly in areas that we talked about that we intersected with around disinformation. That's part of something that is troubling democracy, or maybe let's not say disinformation anymore, a problematic or polluted information ecosystem, where we see the concentration of power in this tech elite, a concentration of tech power that's in the United States and in China, and that's not diffused globally as well too, so it has a lack of diversity there. And also, we haven't even started to talk about artificial intelligence and the impacts that that will have. Will that, according to the utopian framings, contribute to more equality, more human flourishing, or will it very quickly reinforce some of these dynamics that are problematic that we're seeing? And my outlook is unfortunately turning to that pessimistic viewpoint. So inequality on lots of different levels that's impacting us on a global scale and on a national scale. And if you allow the connection as well too in terms of this kind of global elite, we're seeing how it feeds into conspiracy theories like, say, QAnon, where they say there's this global cabal, this global elite that is taking over the world, harming children.
In pizza restaurants in DC?
Yeah. So a crazy kind of conspiracy theory that's actually not so crazy when you're taking a look at what's happening in the news right now and you're seeing the release of the Epstein files. What it is showing, there is an unaccountable global elite, right? And so it's fueling kind of some of the crazier elements of this that are more damaging and actually pointing to some very real dynamics around an unaccountability of global elite that hold a very strong concentration of power and wealth.
Without getting too distracted by Jeffrey Epstein, that whole situation is, I think, incredibly troubling on so many levels, but particularly this sense that, the elite were getting away with something really rotten, criminal, but really rotten. And there were all these interconnected networks of business, politics, royalty, exploiting innocent young women, girls, some of them. And that this whole thing is just a we're just their playthings and they do deals and get ahead. I mean, in the end, you can see the grievances. There's a legitimacy to them from this Epstein scandal that is no doubt feeding some pretty concerning decline in trust in our institutions and our political leadership.
Yeah, and you see it in, say, the trajectory of, say, certain U.S. politicians like Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example. You know, she came into power, a populist wave through the QAnon movement, was very seized of the whole Epstein issue as well, too. And she's a very interesting kind of case study in how all of this really intersects. And it also points actually to the fallout that she eventually had with Trump over the Epstein files as well, too. So in one sense, she used it as a vehicle for her political engagement. On the other hand, she's also serving that instrument of populism that we just talked about that is trying to pinpoint some very real issues that we need to be paying attention to.
But it's got to be a wake-up call for elites too. They
Absolutely,
have to respond to the grievances of the non-elites, for want of a better word, for everyday people, because there's a clear example of criminal, corrupt behaviour. It was part of a broader conspiracy, but there's quite a large element of truth in this. So, what's the elite response?
Well, in the United States, it seems to be not very much accountability at all. I mean, if you take a look at the responses comparatively, say, with the US and the UK is melting down over revelations coming out of the Epstein files.
The Prime Minister may have to resign.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas in the US, it just feeds into this lack of accountability of the elite, which is not doing anything good for American democracy.
Thank you, Lydia. Stephen Wilkes. Hello, Stephen, in Canberra. Great to have a question from you. Please comment on the role of public education in sustaining democracy by preserving civic values, teaching cultural awareness. Is its importance overrated? And if not, what is the best way to teach these values and awareness? Who would like a stab at that?
Yeah, I think go
for it.
We've got to be careful because public education actually was a source of one of the greatest civic divides for a lot of Australian history with the Catholic-Protestant divide. But I think it does, I would say, education more broadly, primary, secondary education, does play a really important role in inculcating civic values. And I think, again, harking back to what we were talking about earlier with Menzies, I think one of the main things it needs to do that it's probably failing to do is have that aspect of inspiration, that it's not just the dry civics, that it is civics in action, civics in context, which you actually teach through history. And Menzies was a big proponent of this idea of the great procession, that you celebrate people who have gone before you and what they've achieved, so you get a greater sense of your own moment right now, the obligations that are on you to pass something on to the next generation. And I think that legacy is really broken down with that generational divide that Lydia was talking about just before, this idea that people have given up on having kids because the whole paradigm that each generation will have a more enjoyable life than the previous one, that's no longer there. That there is a real deep-seated crisis that cuts across everything. So it's not education alone without, improvements in living standards that are going to solve this, but it's an important component.
Would you have a response to the importance of education in sustaining democracy?
Yeah, of course, it's critical. I'm always banging the drum for more civics education in Australia. I think it's a huge gap.
Are we doing it right, though? Because, I have two kids, you have two kids, you have two kids. Ours are at high school and late primary school, so that they do civics, there's a Canberra trip for some or an online experience for others. There seems to be exposure to it, but I just wonder if it's effective.
I don't think it's robust enough. If I compare it to my own civics education, it was something that was taught every year and history was taught every year and it was compulsory. So I think that Australian students might get a taste of it, but it's not robust or deep enough. And to Zach's point as well, too, that it's not just about the mechanics and the levels of government, although that's really important. I mean, the level of knowledge within the general public of that is shockingly low. But in addition to that, I think where Australia does have a gap is in terms of civil society and its function. There's a high degree still of engagement and volunteerism. All of that stuff is good. It's declining, but it's still there. But there is a sense in Australia that the government is responsible for a lot. That puts a lot of pressure on government and a lot of expectations. And so if you compare it to other democracies, there's a much more robust civil society sector that I think we need to work toward cultivating in Australia a bit more.
Is that a result of an overly affluent society insofar as we pay a lot of taxes, so we have a government who can step in. And, I just think of like the local football club. It used to be completely funded by community members who would raise money through sausage sizzles and the like, the fundraiser with the big red line and ratcheting up as they raise more and more funds towards the ultimate goal. And then, they'd build the new clubhouse. And like these days you go and you get your government grant to it in the upcoming election, and the government or the opposition will say, yes, we're giving $1 million for the, Malvern Football Club. And there you go, the candidate's elected, and there's sort of an element of transaction there, rather sort of dodgy. I mean, is there an expectation that government should just do all of this, and that we lose the sort of ties that bind at a community level when we allow government to step in?
I mean, look, my personal view is I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think one of our strengths, and a strength of many, robust democracies, is that you do have a strong social safety net and a strong healthcare system, lots of government support across all levels. All of that is important. But when I talk about civil society, it's more about not replacing what government can do, but augmenting it. I take a look at the field that I'm in, for example, in terms of taking a look at addressing extremism and violent extremism. In Europe and in the United States, there's a very strong, robust civil society sector that actually helps to address those issues. In Australia, we're very heavily reliant on government services for something like that. And there's an important role to play in all aspects, I think, of trying to make our democracy resilient that civil society can factor into and complement the government services and the social safety net that we have.
Yeah. A question here from Caroline Solanes to both of you. Does the research and reporting regarding this topic in your findings identify the presence and or an increase of AI as a form of expression and influence? So deep fakes, misinformation, disinformation. I think, Lydia, you probably have a response to that.
Yes, I think, obviously with generative AI, it's kind of exploded at the moment. One of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is that we're trying to move so quickly in terms of the productivity and economic benefit of artificial intelligence. And no doubt that there will be some, but it's not balanced by, I think, a commensurate or appropriate level of safety around this. If you hear some of the stories of people who were working in the field, working, say, for Anthropic or, the Sam Altman and that released ChatGPT, for example, there are people who have stepped away with that because they felt that those platforms were moving too quickly, right?
Yeah.
And not ensuring safety. And I think that that's something that really does concern me. And again, that concentration of power that we spoke to earlier as one that contributes to democracy. And I'm also concerned that we're going to live in a world where there will be an AI inequality divide, where it will benefit those who know how to harness it and use it, and those that don't, or don't have the education or the wherewithal to try to harness it in particular ways. So that'll contribute to inequality in that sense. And certainly with, the information environment, we're seeing cases of deep fakes and exploitation. There was a big concern in 2024, the so-called year of the election, where we had many different elections take place across the world, that would be a big issue with deep fakes. We did see some of it, but not as much as we anticipated. So it's a wait and see. I am kind of on the pessimistic side of where this might lead, but nothing is definitive yet.
Yeah. Well, Zach, disinformation, misinformation, obviously pre-AI in our history has, it's been a feature. We've seen it before. Yes, AI is moving faster and cleverer than probably historical examples. But can you give examples of how we've overcome misinformation campaigns in Australia?
Well, a lot of it comes down to obviously sort of critical thinking skills and platforms and the ability to raise the other point of view. And I think that's where the Menzian angle on the whole AI issue comes up, is that the AI issue is not just that AI might produce some false information or make it easier to disseminate false information. The real problem with AI is that AI destroys our own critical thinking skills, because every time we have a hard intellectual task, we put it into ChatGPT and get it to provide us with the answers. I mean, you've got your mug there playing off of Menzies' quote about lifters and leaners growing flabby. Well, we're growing intellectually flabby. the more we rely on AI. And I think that's going to be more difficult to overcome than just the false information itself.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I feel it sometimes when I put things into ChatGPT and think, I could have thought about this, but I just am asking ChatGPT to do the thinking for me. Yeah.
It's this kind of atrophy. But one of the things too, I think that's particularly troubling, again, I say it's my job to bring up all the the problems, is that it's not so much a matter of disinformation or misinformation or even deep fakes persuading us in a way that's manipulative. It's more so that it actually can more rapidly destroy our consensus reality. And that's very troubling. It's the fact that what we know to be true, how we can engage with each other, particularly in a democracy where we are reliant on our collective sense making, is that whether it's social media, before or AI now, it is working to erode our consensus reality where we know something to be true based on the reflection of others around us. And it's driving us into these kind of various, we can call
my truth,
yes,
this type of
that
thing.
kind of thing. Yeah. And so I think that's particularly a troubling issue as well.
Yeah, I would completely agree. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we've got time for today. This episode of Afternoon Light Live. Thank you for joining us. A huge thank you to Lydia for your participation, not only in the dialogue, but in today. And pleasure. Good luck with the Understanding Democratic Erosion piece. It's a really, really cool website. I enjoyed playing around with it. And thank you, Zach, as ever, for all your insights, particularly the history, which we need more and more of these days. So thank you very much. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.